In the spring of 2011, a wave of hope and change swept across the Arab world. Known as the Arab Spring, it saw citizens in countries like Tunisia and Egypt rise up to demand freedom and dignity from their long-standing rulers. This spirit of defiance soon reached Syria, a nation that had been quiet for decades under the heavy hand of its government. The fire of revolution was lit not in the capital, Damascus, but in the southern city of Daraa. A small group of teenage boys, inspired by the slogans they saw on television, scrawled a now-famous message on a school wall. "It's your turn, doctor," a direct challenge to President Bashar al-Assad, who had trained as an eye doctor. Their simple act of graffiti would have unimaginable consequences. The government's reaction was swift and brutal, a hallmark of its decades-long approach to any form of dissent. The boys were arrested by the security forces and subjected to torture. When their families and local elders pleaded for their release, the head of local security mocked them, telling them to forget their children and make new ones. This callous disregard for human life and basic justice was the final insult for the people of Daraa. What began as a plea for the release of a few children quickly transformed into a citywide protest. Thousands of ordinary Syrians took to the streets, no longer just asking for their sons back, but demanding freedom, an end to corruption, and respect for their basic human rights. The protests in Daraa did not remain an isolated event. News of the government's cruelty spread like wildfire across the country, amplified by social media and word of mouth. For the first time in a generation, Syrians in other cities and towns felt emboldened to break the wall of fear that had surrounded them for so long. From the coastal cities to the eastern plains, people began to organize their own peaceful demonstrations. They chanted slogans calling for reform, for an end to the emergency law that gave security forces unchecked power, and for a future where their voices could be heard without fear of arrest, torture, or death. This initial phase of the Syrian revolution was marked by a powerful sense of unity and hope. It was a grassroots movement, driven by ordinary people from all walks of life. Students, workers, farmers, and professionals. They were not seeking violence or chaos. They were simply asking for the same freedoms that people in other parts of the world took for granted. They marched peacefully, carrying Syrian flags and olive branches as symbols of their non-violent intentions. However, the government saw these calls for change not as a legitimate demand from its people, but as a direct threat to its absolute power, setting the stage for a tragic and violent confrontation. To understand why so many Syrians were willing to risk everything to protest, one must look back at the nearly 40 years of rule by the Assad family. Hafez al-Assad came to power in 1970, establishing a one-party state where any opposition was crushed. He built a powerful and feared security apparatus, the Mukhabarat, whose agents were present in every corner of society, listening for any word of criticism against the regime. People lived under a constant state of emergency, which stripped them of their legal rights and allowed the government to arrest anyone for any reason. This system created an atmosphere of pervasive fear, where neighbors spied on neighbors, and even private conversations could lead to a prison sentence or worse. When Bashar al-Assad inherited the presidency from his father in 2000, some hoped for a Damascus Spring and a period of reform. These hopes were quickly extinguished. While he presented a more modern face to the world, the underlying structure of the police state remained firmly in place. Freedom of speech was non-existent. The government controlled all media, and access to the internet was heavily monitored and censored. Websites like YouTube and Facebook were often blocked, and those who dared to post critical opinions online were hunted down. Speaking out against the government was considered a crime against the state, and thousands of political prisoners languished in Syria's notorious prisons. The regime also maintained its power by discriminating against certain groups and favoring others. Syria is a diverse country with many different ethnic and religious communities. The Assad family, who belonged to the Alawite minority, filled key positions in the military and security forces with loyal members of their own sect. This created deep resentment among the Sunni majority and other groups who felt excluded from power. The Kurdish minority in particular faced systematic discrimination. Their language and culture were suppressed, they were denied basic citizenship rights, and many were effectively stateless in their own homeland, unable to get official documents, own property, or find formal employment. This long history of oppression meant that by 2011, generations of Syrians had grown up without ever experiencing true freedom. They were taught from a young age to praise the president and never question the Ba'ath Party's authority. They learned to live with the knowledge that a wrong word could lead to their disappearance. The system was designed to break the human spirit and ensure complete obedience. The protests were not just about political or economic complaints. They were a collective roar from a people who were tired of being treated as subjects rather than citizens, and who yearned to reclaim their dignity and their voice after decades of enforced silence. Alongside the political oppression, deep-seated economic problems fueled the growing anger across Syria. For years, many Syrians struggled with widespread poverty and a lack of opportunity, while a small, well-connected elite close to the Assad regime grew fabulously wealthy. A large portion of the population lived in difficult conditions. Before 2011, it was estimated that about 1/3 of Syrians lived in poverty, and unemployment was rampant, especially among the youth who saw little hope for a stable future. The government's economic policies, which were supposed to create a socialist market economy, largely benefited corrupt officials and their business partners, while ordinary families found it harder and harder to make ends meet. This difficult situation was made dramatically worse by a severe drought that struck the country between 2007 and 2010. It was the worst drought in Syria's modern history, turning once fertile farmlands in the northeast into barren dust bowls. Hundreds of thousands of farming families lost their crops, their livestock, and their entire way of life. With no support from the government, up to 1.5 million people were forced to abandon their rural homes and migrate to the overcrowded outskirts of cities like Damascus, Aleppo, and Dara. They arrived desperate and destitute, finding themselves in sprawling, informal settlements with poor sanitation, no jobs, and little social support. The influx of these displaced rural communities placed immense strain on already struggling urban centers. It created a large, impoverished underclass that felt abandoned and ignored by the state. These were the people who had the least to lose and the most to gain from a fundamental change in the country. The government's failure to manage the drought crisis or provide any meaningful relief was seen as another example of its incompetence and indifference to the suffering of its people. The economic grievances of the poor were not separate from their political ones. They were two sides of the same coin, born from a system that hoarded both wealth and power for a select few. Furthermore, corruption was a part of daily life. To get a job, a government permit, or even basic services, bribes were often necessary. The president's cousin, Rami Makhlouf, was a notorious figure who was said to control a huge portion of the Syrian economy, from telecommunications to real estate. His immense wealth, flaunted while so many suffered, became a powerful symbol of the regime's greed. For ordinary Syrians, this combination of poverty, displacement, and systemic corruption created a sense of profound injustice. Their desire for freedom was inseparable from their demand for economic fairness and a life of dignity, free from hardship and humiliation. The Syrian revolution began with peaceful marches and hopeful chants, but it did not stay that way for long. The Assad regime refused to listen to the demands of the protesters or engage in any meaningful dialogue. Instead, it responded with overwhelming and indiscriminate violence. Security forces and armed militias were ordered to open fire on unarmed demonstrators in cities across the country. Snipers took up positions on rooftops, picking off people in the crowds below. The government's message was clear: there would be no compromise, and all dissent would be met with lethal force. This brutal crackdown only served to deepen the people's anger and resolve. For every protester killed by the security forces, more people would join the funeral procession the next day, which would then turn into another protest. A vicious cycle of protest and bloodshed emerged. Seeing the government's unwillingness to relent, some members of the Syrian army began to defect, refusing to fire on their own people. These defectors started to form small, localized armed groups to protect demonstrators from the regime's attacks. What had started as a non-violent movement began to take on the characteristics of an armed rebellion, driven by the need for self-defense against a government that was waging war on its own citizens. The transformation from peaceful protest to armed conflict was a gradual and tragic process. The international community was slow to react, and the conflict became more complex as regional and global powers began to intervene, supporting different sides. The initial, unified call for freedom and democracy fractured as the fighting intensified, and various armed groups with different agendas emerged. The government, meanwhile, deliberately framed the entire uprising as a foreign-backed terrorist conspiracy, a narrative it used to justify its extreme violence against any and all opposition, whether peaceful or armed. This strategy further polarized the society and closed the door to any political solution. In the end, the government's violent response is what turned a popular uprising into a devastating civil war. The peaceful calls for reform were drowned out by the sounds of gunfire and shelling. The hope of the Arab Spring gave way to a humanitarian crisis of staggering proportions, leading to the displacement of millions of Syrians and the destruction of entire cities. The story of the Syrian revolution is a tragic reminder of how a people's legitimate demand for dignity and freedom can be met with such brutality that it pushes a nation into a spiral of violence, changing the country and its people forever.